Okay, so thanks, Robert, for taking the time to speak to us. Can you
Sure.
just give us a brief introduction? I'm sure most of our audience know exactly who you are, but do you want to give us a brief introduction of just who you are and what you do at AMD?
Yeah, my name's Robert Hallock, and I lead technical marketing for Ryzen CPUs, consumer Ryzen CPUs at AMD.
Perfect, yeah. So, like I said, I'm sure everybody knows you, but in this one, we're going to be speaking about Ryzen 6000, so the new mobile chips launched recently. We've been lucky enough to
Mhm.
have hands on with the Zephyrus G14, which used the Ryzen 9 6900HS. But I guess the first question I'll start off with then was can you highlight the reasons for deciding to opt for the high performance cores versus the hybrid approach that we see from your competitor?
Sure. I actually want to start with what our competitor's done because I think that might help illustrate why we've done what we did. And if you're just looking at CPUs from the point of view of die size, cost, that's a metric that we don't talk a lot about in the public collectively, users, media, us, but die size is a big deal because it determines how many cores you can put in, what instruction sets you can put in, what the cost of that chip is to the end consumer, et cetera, et cetera. And our competitor, from a Skylake point of view, being on that Skylake architecture from 2016 on, was reaching some pretty serious die size constraints, which means cost constraints, which means core count scaling constraints. We took a different approach in the Zen era. When we started Zen as a project, which was now nearly 10 years ago, we wanted to make a core that was physically smaller than Skylake at the time. And so we could fit more of them on a die. They could scale to higher performance and lower power than Skylake at the time. And that continues to pay dividends today. So if we fast forward to 2022, what you're seeing is we can drive our cores to lower power than our competitors' E-cores or efficiency cores, extract more battery life out of them, but also tune them up to high performance. And that CPU design with that set of cores covers about 93% of all the notebooks sold. And so if you ask us why did we do this, it's because we have a smaller core, we have a more efficient core, we have a better process technology that scales to lower power, higher density, and that means we had a different set of challenges than our competitor to address. They were limited on power and die size, and we were not. And so when you have two different sets of technical challenges, that takes you to a place with two different sets of technical solutions.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think we've seen, particularly since Zen 2, I think I put that as kind of the line in the sand, is that the power efficiency has been superb and the scalability, like you said, has been fantastic. And we've seen that particularly on the server side of things as well. So would it be fair to say that actually the Zen, the underlying design for the high performance servers, actually scales nicely down to the mobile side of things too?
It's the same instruction set, right? What the Zen core you see in a server in EPYC is the same Zen core that you see in a notebook. And they may have different features turned on and off, or the process technology may be tuned a little differently for frequency or performance or power, but fundamentally, we're talking about the same core technology scaling from 9 watts in a notebook all the way up to large servers, which that's incredible. It's an amazing scalability, and it's not something that our competitor is doing because they can't with the technologies that they have.
So I think it's fair to summarize there that it's almost as if the underlying Zen core in itself is, in some respects, a hybrid approach already because you have such a level of scalability where you can kind of change the underlying settings and get high performance, or change some other underlying settings and get better power efficiency.
It's a good point. I mean, if we look at the bulk of the laptop market, vast majority is buying 15 watt, 28 watt, ultra thin, below 19 millimeters or so. And we offer not only more performance in that category with the 6000 series, but also longer battery life. And so what's the point of performance cores and efficiency cores, which are supposed to be really good at both of those things, if the one core AMD is building can do better? That is why we continue with Zen. That is why we're continuing to invest in these cores, because to your point, it's effectively hybrid already.
So I guess following up from that is, how difficult is the trade-off process when it comes to scaling things back for the lower power operation? Because there has to be a compromise somewhere. And I guess this is a bit more difficult than thinking, oh, we'll tone the frequency down a little bit. I'm sure there's more to it.
There's a lot more to it. So you can look at it from a time point of view. You have a limited amount of time to engineer new features into the device. And so those could be efficiency features, those could be architectural, those could be SoC design. And you have to decide what you leave on the table and what you don't. So you saw in Zen 3 Plus that it's a very energy-focused design. We're not investing in new core architecture. We didn't increase IPC. Frequencies didn't go up a ton. But because of the power changes, because of the time spent there, we can bring that chip to a higher average level of performance by leveraging that efficiency. So it's a roundabout way of getting to higher performance, but it's not the direct attack from an IPC or frequency point of view that you might take in, say, a desktop architecture. So those are just some of the trade-offs. Time is a big one. Maximum frequency versus low power is a big one. If you want to scale to lower power, you do have to give something up at the top end, and that means that the 6000 series is, you're not going to see a lot of them in desktop replacement type notebooks. That's just not where we targeted the design. We're trying to hit this more compact, efficient space where most people buy. But that's the trade-off.
Yeah, it makes sense. How much of a benefit is TSMC 6 nanometer been for Ryzen 6000?
It's hard to say from an energy efficiency point of view, because it's really hard to pluck apart like the power stuff that you've done from the process stuff that you've done. But density is improved, double-digit density improvement. I don't have the exact percentage, but that allows us to pack in more features, more power management features. Specifically, it allowed us to add new voltage rails into the CPU that didn't exist before for finer grain control of display controllers going on and off, new power states. USB 4 is integrated into the SoC now, so we can get more features into the die and grow the die size a little bit, but also bring down power, which is a win for everybody. And so process leadership is huge for us. I'm not so sure there's been enough talking about that. If you look at our competitors' products, very strong at 100 watts plus in mobile, but performance falls off a cliff below 35 watts. And the number of performance cores that you get in that package also falls off a cliff below 35 watts, and it's worth asking why. Why does that happen? And it's almost certainly a process problem. When you're sacrificing tons of core count and tons of performance as the wattage scales down, it means you just don't have the headroom to continue extracting performance. So that's another dimension of TSMC giving us an advantage by being able to take the same 8 cores and moving it up and down to any power envelope and continuing to deliver great performance.
Yeah. So you've mentioned the 15 watt parts and obviously the scalability up to the HX parts are kind of 45 watts plus.
Yeah.
Would you say there's a sweet spot? And if so, where is that sweet spot? Would it be kind of the 35 watt, maybe 28 watts?
Yeah, 28 to 35 I think is the real sweet spot in power versus performance. Although I will say that's more of a overall SoC point of view. Like you get a lot out of the graphics by going from 15 to 28 or 28 to 35. I'm just talking about integrated. But CPU goes up a healthy step from 15 to 28, sustained performance, multi-core performance, and then 28 to 35 is relatively minor. So 28 to 35 for graphics, 28-ish for CPU.
So those HS parts are looking like the kind of the sweet spot for the enthusiast stuff, like we saw
Absolutely.
with the Zephyrus G14, which is kind of the go-to launch laptop.
That's what we're seeing in the market. Those ultra thin designs. It wouldn't have been too long ago. You would have called those an ultrabook or an ultra thin, a gaming laptop of that size. But now it's a gaming laptop, and that is the only growing market segment in gaming notebooks. Everything else is flat to down. So when we're thinking about what people are buying and what we should design to sell in a notebook, that's why. That's why 28, 35, and 15 are the sweet spots for us.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I have to say, from a personal perspective, that kind of 14-inch high performance, that's my personal preference. I can kind of
Mine too.
see the intention there. You just get
Yeah.
a nice balance. That's what I personally quite like.
Yeah, I mean, you can get 12 hours of battery life out of a gaming notebook now. It's crazy.
Yeah, that actually really impressed me with
Yeah.
the 6900HS powered G14. Was the battery life
Yeah.
was kind of double-digit number of hours, which is unthinkable of something that can play games competently at 1080p.
Absolutely.
Granted, with our efficient discrete GPU in there, yeah. Okay, so I think we'll move on to the SoC now, if that's okay.
Of course.
So the SoC has had some major improvements since obviously the previous generation of Ryzen 5000 mobile. How do you go about deciding what gets included and why? So, for example, kind of new PCIe generation and improvement to DDR5, they're obviously the notable ones, but there's so much more also.
It comes back to a couple things. I mean, to at the simplest point of view, we kind of list out all the changes we could make, and then go, okay, which one of these are the most impactful? We're always from a blunt point of view, it's like what's the weak area of the last chip, right? Because that's the most obvious opportunity to improve. So going from 5000 to 6000 series, we knew that we had opportunity to bring down fabric power, which explains the new power states in the 6000 series for the Infinity Fabric. We knew the industry was trending more towards new display technologies like sub 1 watt panels, or displays that can refresh just a region inside the panel, like a video frame on an otherwise static display. So that necessitates display controller changes. We talk to our partners and ask where they're headed with their design portfolio. Do they want to get thinner? Do they want to keep the same chassis and go to longer battery life? And all of this goes into a melting pot, a committee, really. And what pops out is the sort of ranked list of things that we can fit into the time we have that are the most impactful changes, and that becomes the product.
Okay, slight diversion from the list of questions that we got here, but
Sure.
you mentioned the partners. How much influence do the partners have, and how difficult is that from AMD's perspective? And the reason I ask that is because obviously on the desktop side of things, when you design a CPU and you have the AGESA profile, you have a lot of control. Whereas on the mobile side of things, when the laptop vendor is going to be dictating the chassis, the power delivery, the cooling system, it seems like you've kind of got slightly less control, so you have to work perhaps more closely. Would that be fair to say?
More closely is definitely the case. So you pointed out the desktop side, and desktop market snaps very quickly to a new standard. Hey, it's a new BIOS update. You get 1 million downloads in a week. You put out a new motherboard, people snap to it. It's quick. Notebook is a lot longer. Notebook happens in kind of the year lead up to the product actually being announced. Is intense co-development with partners, chassis designs, thermal designs, firmware features, platform optimization, bug finding. And then once you get into that calendar year, you notice that all the laptops don't launch at once. It's kind of staggered throughout the year. You get the ones at CES, which are largely gaming notebooks. Then you get to May, June, which in the US we call dads and grad season. And those are your thinner notebooks. And then you get into back to school season in the late fall, late summer, and holiday, US Thanksgiving and Christmas. And notebooks come in waves at each of those points throughout the year. And the reason why is that the thinner the platform gets, the longer it takes to engineer that design, the more support it needs going both directions between the vendor and AMD. We'll even design like special firmware for them or custom features for them to help them hit these design targets they're trying to hit. And So laptops are way more co-engineering than anybody believes, and that's why laptops have such a long cycle relative to desktop, why you don't just see 200 notebooks on January 1st. They come out throughout the year.
Yeah, okay. And you say with the integration with the vendors there, so obviously the new platform management framework, so the PMF, is that something that was driven by AMD, so you have slightly more control and slightly more influence over how your products are operating in your partners' laptops? Or was it driven by the vendors wanting perhaps a little bit more support so they get the last few percentage points of performance out of your chips?
It's a little bit of both, actually. What PMF enables is longer battery life and more performance in an even thinner chassis, because the SoC can be more intelligent about what's going on from a CPU load and power consumption point of view. There's more telemetry coming in. So that helps extend the boundaries of what's possible in a thin envelope. But also it allows the user more control. Fundamentally, a user, I'm just talking the average Joe consumer, they don't know a high performance plan from a balance plan. They're not going to go in and adjust the Windows slider. It's just not in the realm of thinking, right? The laptop, you take it out of the box, you turn it on, you set it up, and you get what you get. And so designing a system where we can give people sort of a power-saving power plan behavior if a user is doing that thing, or a high-performance plan behavior if the user is doing that thing, without them thinking about it, that's a win, because we can extend the performance and battery range of that product automatically without asking the user to intervene and make decisions. So it's one part product and it's one part user benefit.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And I noticed there's been quite a few AMD technologies over the past couple of generations at least. So kind of the smart shift, that kind of
Exactly.
springs to mind, which I quite like using. But I guess, do you have any information from behind the scenes? Was that kind of just a light bulb moment by somebody thinking, well, hold on, we've got this cooling system on the CPU side of things that doesn't always need to do full power. Can we share some of that with the GPU and vice versa?
I think it felt like a light bulb moment, but it was more evolutionary for us, given the fact that if you have a Radeon and a Ryzen chip, they both have Infinity Fabric in them. We had that point-to-point link over PCI Express already. There was some amount of information being passed back and forth for driver purposes, for firmware purposes, but we took it to the next step by saying, wait a minute, we can do, I'll call it power sloshing if you want to. We can recognize when the load is low or high and move things around and fit more into a smaller space. And so that's the genesis of Smart Shift, but it really was just the next stone on a path we were already walking down.
Okay. And on the SoC side of things, was it an easy decision at this point to go for DDR5 and LPDDR5? Was that kind of just a bit of a no-brainer type decision?
Absolutely. Absolutely. When we were starting the 6000 series program, we went to all the major memory IC vendors and shared with them our rough forecast for the year, how many CPUs we thought would be in circulation, and we all saw eye to eye on what the supply needed to be. And I know there's concerns out there around PMIC availability and DDR5 supply, but from a notebook point of view, it's we hashed that out a while ago with the memory vendors. And the benefit is really obvious for us. It gives a ton more memory bandwidth to graphics, which is huge in a constrained APU type environment. Anytime you have integrated graphics, more memory bandwidth helps. And then from a overall platform power point of view, non-CPU sources are actually taking a bigger and bigger slice of the pie now in terms of overall battery life. So anything we can enable to bring platform power down, it makes the battery life longer, and that accrues to us. They don't think, oh, wow, this insert vendor here laptop has bad battery life. They think my AMD laptop has bad battery life or good battery life. So anything we can do to inflate the overall power savings in the system through external sources we're going to do it. That it just makes sense. We have to think about not just what we want to do or can do, but what we can enable for our partners.
Okay, so you mentioned the integrated GPU. We'll come back to that in a second. But just again on the DDR5 LP DDR5 point, is there any benefit to one or the other from the AMD perspective, or is it more a case of, well, this is simply down to the vendor's intention, whether they want a really ultra long battery life, 15 watt type system, or whether they want a bit higher performance from the gaming type system?
It's that, you know, it's one part form factor, one part battery, one part final performance. LP makes a lot of sense if you're building thin and light because its overall power consumption is just smaller, but it has a smaller memory bus internally. It has more but smaller memory ranks, I'll call it, internally. Whereas D5, larger form factor, you need slots for it on the motherboard, takes up vertical height, even if you lay it down flat, but it has lower memory latency, which is good for games. So that's kind of the split why you see LP in gaming notebooks and normal DDR5 LP in non-gaming notebooks and DDR5 in gaming notebooks, just performance and power.
Okay, makes sense. So sticking with the SoC just for a minute, USB 4, can you talk to us about that? Because it seems as if it's still slightly confusing from a consumer perspective, to be perfectly honest, with the certification, some devices supporting it, and then the crossover with Thunderbolt.
Sure. So let's see. So USB 4, like DisplayPort, like HDMI, has a basic set of capabilities and then optional features you can add on top. Optional features include 40 gigabit per second transfer rate, DMA-based security, external PCI Express graphics, and we've just added all the external features, all the additional optional features to our SoC. And we've also not validated any 20 gigabit per second devices for our ecosystem, so they're all 40 gigabit. And what that means, lastly, is that Thunderbolt as well is an optional feature of the spec. And we are still going through the certification process with the USB Implementers Forum, but our goal is to end up in a place where Thunderbolt devices are interoperable with USB 4. And that's kind of the intent of the spec as well, if you adopt all the right features to enable that interoperability, which we have. Internally, looks good. We've had Thunderbolt devices running over USB 4 on 6000 series development platforms. And then I think as we get towards May and June here, you'll start to see actual USB 4 enabled systems with AMD inside, which, again, our intent is Thunderbolt will work with those platforms. That's the goal.
Was this something pushed by AMD, or was it kind of, like we've mentioned previously, a back and forth with the vendors? Because basically one of the age-old points was, yeah, I love AMD laptops, they look fine for my usage, but I need Thunderbolt. Well, that doesn't look like it's the case going forward.
I think this is the kind of trajectory of all interface standards over time. You know, anytime you have something proprietary and vendor specific, it ultimately gets replaced or subsumed by something that is an industry standard. And we're at that point with USB 4. It offers all the same capabilities. It's not vendor specific anymore. It'll be widespread and available. The technology is new. We're an early adopter. I want to be clear about that. But USB 4 is USB is everywhere, and I truly believe that USB 4 will be everywhere for the types of devices that need it and can benefit from it. So for us, kind of a no-brainer. It's just the next step on USB. We've been doing that since USB 1, so we'll keep doing it.
The other part of the SoC that quite impressed me, actually, was the display capabilities in various different facets. So not only the integrated GPU, which I promise we will get to in a second. I feel like I'm putting this off, sorry. But not only the integrated GPU side of things, but the new advanced codec supports, the improved kind of H.264, H.265 support. But not only that, the core display output capabilities. Can you just speak a little bit about that and what made you go for that? Because you're going to have to excuse the reference here, but it almost seems as if Ryzen 6000 has gone to Apple-esque levels of display capability, where previously, if you wanted kind of 3-4 high-resolution monitors, that was the domain where a MacBook Pro, for example, would be excellent and everything else would be a bit of a question mark. Well, that doesn't seem like the case now.
Well, I'm insulted. No, I'm not.
I'm good at insulting people, sorry.
I think what you saw is we finally hit the right point in time where AMD could bring RDNA graphics architecture into an APU. We launched last year with the Vega architecture in the 5000 series, and it's been an ongoing project to make that RDNA 2 core smaller, even more efficient, scalable down into that 15-watt envelope we wanted to hit. And that integration work finally finished for the 6000 series. And when we did that, that graphics core not only brought the execution engine, the RDNA 2 graphics engine, but it also brought with it VCN and DCN, that's our video encode and decode capabilities, that are much newer than what was in the Vega architecture. And so that took us to a place where we could support DisplayPort 2, the latest HDMI standards, do it at the full bit rate, run 8K displays, multiple displays. Really excited about that. People are moving towards creativity in their notebooks, or people are expecting more of their notebook, especially in the COVID or post-COVID era. People lost a lot of access to their high-performance desktop or just switched to notebook full-time. And they expect that that notebook will function like their desktop did. And so that's the external market influence coming in to guide our hand beyond just what the engineering roadmap enabled.
Personally, I love a laptop that can do proper display outputs. It's one of my geek points, if I'm being perfectly honest. I love it. Yeah. So on the RDNA 2 GPU, great to finally see it integrated. We've mentioned memory already as we've been talking here. Would it be fair to say that now that we've finally got sufficient memory bandwidth, that was the biggest barrier finally overcome to get RDNA 2 inside the chip, or was it a bit more to it than that?
A bit more to it. I think really it was the integration aspect, moving it out of a standalone discrete chip into something that's sits as a client on the Infinity Fabric integrated within the chip, floor planning the CPU around that graphics engine. That's an entire discipline of engineering all to itself, floor planning and packaging. And that's distinct from core architecture engineering or power engineering. So you really have 4 or 5 different tracks of engineer work going on to bring a chip like that to life. So DDR5 definitely helped, lots of bandwidth there, but we also increased the size of the execution engine by 50% versus last year's Vega. The render backend performance, I believe, doubled in terms of both unit count and capability. And so it was just a really significant inflation in graphics performance, and it just fundamentally takes time to figure out how that all fits.
So what is the overarching goal for the integrated GPU from the AMD perspective, particularly because obviously Ryzen 6000 is scalable between the power bands? So is it competent gaming at 1080p, or is it kind of good acceleration in productivity apps, or is it just kind of a balance between those?
Depends on who you ask at AMD.
All right, okay.
That's the honest answer. Our creator types will tell you at AMD that RDNA 2 graphics was effectively a doubling in content creation apps. So I'm thinking of Blender, which has a GPU accelerated renderer now, and that alone is much faster than the CPU renderer, and we've been able to double the performance of that. So anything with a GPU accelerated renderer is now twice as fast this year, on top of the natural benefit of graphics enabled rendering over a CPU. That's a great improvement. But I think many of us at AMD are gamers, and being able to pick up a 3-pound laptop that can actually comfortably play a game, that's a win. That's what we want to do. We've been trying to do that for years, right? And every new generation brings us closer and closer to that magical every game can do this moment. And I feel like we're there. I feel like there isn't a whole lot that you can't play on the integrated graphics. And I'm not going to say it's a gaming notebook, because it's not, but you can do it. And the frame rates are good. And I think that's a huge achievement. I'm excited about it. It means I have something to do when I go back to my hotel room after a show. I could sit down and play a game or something, or not worry about having maybe a gaming notebook and a normal notebook. I can just have one. Convergence is always the destiny of this market.
And is that something that you actually see quite a bit of demand for? Is that, like say, that kind of one laptop to do it all approach, where you still fundamentally want something thin and light to take to university and lectures, but then you can actually do a little bit of gaming if you're just a casual gamer? Is there a lot of demand for that you see?
Huge demand. I think that is what's driving this market growth in ultra-thin notebooks, gaming notebooks, why that segment is the only one that's growing, because you have a notebook that can play a real game, but also go to work and last the day, or go to school and last the day. It doesn't weigh a ton. It's portable, fits in a backpack. And I think that's also the reason why literally 93% of the market buys a notebook that's 18, 17 millimeters or less, which is ultra thin. That is like the universal truth of this industry, that people are buying thin and light. And so anything we can do to make that more capable, more versatile, we're going to do that. Not only because we have the technology to make it possible, but because that's where the demand trend is going. It's not big, heavy, max performance, max effort notebooks. And that's why we focused our SoC where we did on these power thresholds, because the market is very loud and clear that thin and light is the key.
How difficult is it with the integrated GPU, balancing the resources that you would want to give to the GPU versus the resources that necessitates taken from the CPU cores or the other parts of the SoC, for example?
That's a good question. It is a very delicate balance. I'll start there. But what we see is that a game is oftentimes, let's say you're doing a simultaneous workload, like a game. You're running some amount of CPU, some amount of graphics. A game is not too taxing in terms of overall CPU utilization, and I mean from a power point of view. Games tend to have a few heroic threads that run on a few cores, AI, sound, graphics, and then that leaves a lot of your power budget left for graphics workloads, and vice versa. If you're running a heavy graphics workloads, heavy CPU workload, odds are good that it's not taxing graphics. You're doing something computational, like a renderer. So there's some amount of natural split in the way workloads behave in this market that makes the balance a little easier, but there's a ton of power telemetry going back and forth to kind of estimate the demand coming in on both engines and make sure we're adjusting CPU versus GPU power accordingly to give the best experience. And that's happening 1,000 times a second. Literally 1,000 times a second to get that balance right.
So I guess moving quickly on then, how's the vendor feedback been thus far from your partners? Have they been quite impressed by Ryzen 6000 and what it allows them to do on their models?
I think so. I know coming off of CES, we showed data that was 28 watts versus 15 watts generationally, and some people were scratching their heads like, why did we do that? Because from a customer, and I mean end user point of view, or a customer OEM point of view, the number one concern is how much performance can I fit into this chassis size. I'm not going to make the chassis bigger. I'm not going to make a new one. Just tell me how I can get more performance out of it. And this year, we can fit a 28-watt chip into a form factor that was previously 15. So we can get another 30% CPU performance from a computational point of view. We can get another 25 to 30% out of the graphics going from 15 to 28 watt. And so a customer walks in the door and then they see that this laptop hasn't changed sizes year over year, but this one, the new one with 6000 series, is notably faster because of those efficiency improvements that we've made. Our partners are thinking the same way. They don't think like 15 watt versus 15 watt or 28 versus 28. They just want to know how much performance they can pack into the design they want to make. And we've made a big leap there. So that's why you're seeing designs that are exclusive to AMD, unique to AMD, like the new ThinkPad Z series, very small, very premium, luxurious notebook, because vendors like Lenovo, I think, are recognizing we have this perfect formula for thin and light notebooks, this unbeatable combination of battery life and performance that Alder Lake does not offer, can't offer technologically. And response has been great.
So you referenced it there, but do you think it's fair to say that Ryzen 6000 is opening up new abilities for vendors to go with niche form factors? You kind of referenced it there, but excuse me, kind of gaming tablets, they seem to be something, that type of niche form factor.
I don't think you'll see a lot of tablets just because it's not a huge market, but certainly if you're in the market for thin, light, and the longest battery life, that's going to be AMD this year. And I don't know how many people are in the market to upgrade this year, but I want to state unequivocally that for ultra-thin laptops, 15 watt, 28 watt, AMD will have both more performance and longer battery life than Alder Lake. That is what our technology is enabling. It's the perfect answer for a consumer. Like I've been sitting on the same laptop forever because I've been waiting for this moment, and so I'm going to upgrade this year.
Give us the scoop. Which one are you going for?
I really want one of the new ThinkPad Zs. I think it's 14-inch, 13-inch. All metal chassis, like leather lid. It feels dense, not heavy, just dense. It gives you like this really nice confidence in your hand. I got to try a pilot build or like a demo build about a month ago, and I'm sold. It's a beautiful notebook. I can't wait. Mine's like 6 years old.
It's quite a good age in that case. You probably perhaps overdue an upgrade then.
Yeah, well, I only get like 4 or 5 hours of battery life, and I've just been like waiting for this moment, knowing it was going to come, and I can't tell anybody about it. So
it's funny though how you say that, because 6 years ago, 4 or 5 hours of battery life, you would have gone, it's not bad. These days, I mean, that's almost unthinkable. Mm-hmm. The market's changed
a long way in the industry. It's come a long way. I talk to my friends about this a lot. People who I'm older now, I'm 36, but in my younger years, my friends, we all built computers, had enthusiast PCs, and yada yada. As we all gotten older, had kids, got married, most of them fell off the PC bandwagon, and they have the view that computers haven't changed a whole lot in 5 years. But man, there's been an incredible amount of progress, especially in low power, battery life, just the amount of capability you can squeeze out of a thin and light notebook. And even desktop gaming has gotten leaps and bounds faster in the last couple of years after, frankly, a few years of the industry being pretty flat. So that's one thing I want to say to anybody who hasn't paid close attention to the PC market in a few years. It has really changed for the better. Really changed.
Yeah, it's funny. It's kind of appropriate timing for you to say that, because I'm just looking at my calendar, 31st of March, which means we're, 5 years and a month after the introduction of Ryzen 1000, so Zen. And in that 5 years, like you say, I would strongly agree with you that a lot has changed in that time period, particularly on the CPU side of things, I would have said, which also, of course, feeds down to the mobile side of things.
Absolutely.
So I think I'm going to throw in one cheeky one before we finish off.
All right.
So Zen 3 Plus, obviously we've seen it on the mobile side of things. Is this something we could possibly see on the desktop?
Couldn't speculate. Sorry.
I'll have to leave the speculation to myself then in that case.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much, Robert, for giving us your time and speaking to us about Ryzen 6000. It's been really interesting.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate your time.
I guess before we sign out, I should add, is there anything else you'd like to add to tell our audience before we sign out? Is there any burning points you want to make?
Burning point I want to make. Yeah, I think the final takeaway I want people to think about is, I know the start of the year is front-loaded with a lot of gaming laptops, which, frankly, is a very small slice of the market. It's an interesting slice of the market. We all pay attention to it as enthusiasts, but what I think we don't talk enough about is the rest of the notebook market. I myself come from a hardware review background, big CPUs, big desktops, big notebooks, but it was really eye-opening for me coming to AMD 12 years ago how small that market was compared to everything else. It was my whole world, but it was actually very small. And so I think as the market evolves throughout the year, I would ask people to pay really close attention to what's going on in the ultra-thin category on performance and battery, because I think our competitor is going to have some real challenges there, and challenges that AMD is not going to face. I think it'll become very apparent where energy efficiency leadership lies, process leadership, performance cores. This whole hybrid discussion will be revisited. And I think you'll see a very different ballgame in that space. And it's worth talking about. It's worth asking why that change or that inversion is happening from a technical point of view, because I think it says a lot about the overall strategies of AMD and its competitor as companies. It's going to be a very interesting few months here as additional laptops come out. That's my final word.
I think that's a really interesting point there, because particularly in the UK at the moment, we're kind of, now that, the dreaded issue that we will not name that's been going on for the past 2 years, now that's kind of hopefully changing. We've seen a lot of places go into kind of a hybrid working model where you might do 2 or 3 days in the office and then the balance from home. And it makes the point of these kind of ultra portable, thin and light office type laptops which have competent performance, like you just referenced. They're perhaps more important now than they ever have been in the past, in my personal opinion. So I think it's an interesting point you raised there.
And all we're asking is, what kind of laptop do you want to carry as you think about going back to the office or buying a new notebook? Is it a heavy one that only gives you a few hours of battery? Or is it one that it's a touch less graphics performance, but it'll last you 12 hours? I know which one I'm going to pick every time.
Yeah, I think it's the latter. You want the one where you slip in your backpack, you don't even know it's there, you jump on your bike and you go, and you think, uh-oh, I haven't got my charger, no problem.
That's the one. That's the one.
I would strongly agree with you there, Robert.
Thank you.
Well, that's been fantastic. Thanks for your time, Robert. Really appreciate that.
Thank you very much. We'll talk soon. Appreciate it.
Fantastic. Cheers.